writer doesn't give their name, but she is a neighbor. I think it's a she. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a woman. Here's what they write. I live in a small town in North Mississippi, right below the Tennessee state line in Benton County. This person is my neighbor, one county over. In 2009, I was going through a nasty divorce and a custody battle. My 1-year-old daughter and I had to move in with my parents. They own 30 acres, and after all of us kids moved out, they converted the barn into a 2-bedroom cabin. Growing up, I always had a weird feeling that I couldn't explain when I would be in the barn alone, feeding or messing with the horses, even though I never had any paranormal experiences. My daughter slept in a pack and play because I was unable to bring her crib with us when we had to leave our former home. Around 3:30 a.m. on this particular night, I was in that state where you're asleep but still kind of aware of what's going on around you. And I heard a voice say, "She's waking up." I opened my eyes and I saw 2 little twin girl ghosts who looked to be around 8 years old. They wore antique dresses and their hair was fixed in ringlet curls, just like a pair of Victorian porcelain dolls. Both of them were sitting in front of the pack and play with their legs crossed, looking at my daughter. They must have realized they were being watched by me as they took flight and exited the room. It felt like all the energy left with them. My daughter slept through the whole encounter, but I was so scared that I just laid there wide awake. I never believed in ghosts until that night. I don't think they had any ill intent. I got the feeling that they were behaving like normal girls around that age, fascinated by the baby. My parents still continue to experience paranormal activity in the house, though none of the spirits appear to be menacing or threatening. My mother witnessed the ghost of a little boy dressed in Civil War-era clothing and swore she detected the scent of a woman's perfume in the hallway. And my sister once saw the figure of a man dressed in cowboy clothing. She said he seemed more interested in tending to his chores than bothering with her. There's a dark history to the place. It was once burnt to the ground during the Civil War and rebuilt on the same site. There were rumors of a family with 3 small children buried nearby in unmarked graves. It was assumed that they were bystanders caught in the bloodshed. It's all kind of tragic when you think about it. A farm family innocently going about their business until the war ended up at their front door. And that's the end of that story. But during the Civil War where I live, when the Union forces came through here, they burned and everything. Courthouses, churches. You can look at the historical markers on almost every courthouse in every county in at least North Mississippi, and I'm guessing North Alabama and Georgia. It'll say that this courthouse was burned down during the Civil War and rebuilt in 1889 or, 1876 during the Reconstruction period. But none of it was pleasant for people in the southern states. Nothing about the war was easy. It wasn't just hard. It was much harder on the soldiers, but nothing was easy for the whole population down here. And some people may say, well, they deserved it, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying whether they deserved it or not. I'm just saying that's a fact. It just wasn't easy living for people. And a lot of our customs and a lot of our food and a lot of our language and the way we live in the southern states are marked by that era. And I don't know, it just came to mind with this story. I've read a lot about the Reconstruction era, and from customs to food to in the post-slave culture and everything, it's real interesting stuff. And you kind of find out why I found out why my grandparents ate like they did. I'll just tell you a little story. I remember my grandmother, and this is probably from the Reconstruction area, post-Civil War, and from living through the Great Depression, but she would cook a batch of biscuits, and those biscuits would sit on her stove out in the open for a week until they were all gone. Now today, if we cook a dozen biscuits and you eat 6, you just throw the rest of them away, or you give the rest to the dogs, or we throw them out to the chickens. But they came up in an era where you did not waste an ounce of food. You just didn't waste it. You kept it, and you would eat on it all week. And if you throwing something out that was edible was just absolutely unheard of. And my grandparents wound up in real good shape later in their life, but they were born and raised and came up through the Great Depression, or raised by people who were raising families during that time. And that's how they came about those customs, and they never let go of them. I just think that's so fascinating to me. I'm running this story kind of long. I'm going off on a tangent like I do sometimes when I get talking. But it's interesting stuff, and I don't take any particular pride in it. I don't look down on it, even though I'm Southern born and I've lived here all my life. These are just interesting facts about humanity that really consume me. I love reading about why we do what we do. It's interesting stuff. Okay, let's go to another story. Hey y'all, thanks for clicking on the video, and thanks for joining the Dixiecryptid podcast. I have 4 stories in this podcast, and I'm going to tell you the last story in this set is absolutely awesome. It is so intriguing. I've never read anything like it. It's the very last story. It's a 4-story, and all the other 3 stories ahead of it are great, but this last one just blew my mind. It's really, I've never read anything like it, so I hope you guys enjoy this podcast. All right, here we go. Okay, this story is from Brian, and he gives it a title. He calls it The Larder is Full, Larder. I don't even know what a larder is, but Neoma, who did the edit on this story, she thinks this could be fiction. I don't really know, but it's kind of creepy, but it's a real good story, so I'm going to read it. In 1972, I was 6 years old. One evening after I got ready for bed and said goodnight to my parents, I went to my bedroom and did what most kids do. I played around until I was told to shut those lights out and go to bed. Well, that's how most nights played out at our house. But this night was going to be different. It was one I would never forget. I had just turned off the light and climbed into bed, and I pulled the covers up to my neck and tucked them under my chin, and I laid there letting my eyes slowly adjust to the darkness around me. It took a minute before I began to see it. Something was slowly spinning in my closet. The more my eyes adjusted to the dark, the more I was able to make it out. It was a child. It was a dead child. I couldn't make out if it was a boy or a girl, but it couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. It was caught up in some kind of mesh bag spinning there right next to my snowsuit. Its legs were pulled up to its chest, with its left arm tucked into its chest and its right arm up by its head. And as I watched, its body began to gleam with sort of a luminescent sweat that was bleeding from its pores and gathering in the runnels at the base of the body, and then dripping onto the floor below it as though it were roasting in an oven. As the pool of fluid grew, it served to further illuminate the terrible scene before me. Its head and right arm were sticking up out of the bag, with its right hand curled up over the top of its head, forming a ghastly parody of a question mark. It was as if the child were questioning its peculiar condition. Its body was dried, glazed, and baked, just like a holiday ham, with a brown sugary glaze smeared all over it, as if for some monstrous beast intent on eating it for supper. The strange luminescent fluid steadily dripped onto the floor, covering my toys and splashing onto the back wall of the closet like some kind of hellish ectoplasmic urine. It was becoming more real by the second. Had I waited a moment longer, or had my voice failed me, it would have been here with me, or I would have been there with it. "Mom!" I screamed. She came running into the room and turned on the light. And as the light swallowed up the darkness, the figure disappeared. It had gone back into the ether. That thin spot in the membrane had closed over and the vision had evaporated into the night. I did my best to explain to my mother what I had seen while she did her best to try and calm me. She said it was just my snowsuit twisting and throwing shadows into the closet, but I know it wasn't. I know what I saw. It was not my snowsuit, and it was not my overactive imagination. Well, Mom kissed my forehead and turned my dresser lamp on that night. I didn't get much sleep. That was the night I began sleeping with my covers over my head, and I continued to do that until I was 13. It was the most horrific thing I had ever seen. I believe things leak through, overlap sometimes, and pierce their way painfully into our dimension. The universe is a strange place. It's the shotgun marriage of heaven and hell. There's plenty of space for all of our beliefs and dreams and nightmares out there, don't you think? Secretly waiting, tucked into the darkness of space and time for whatever comes across them. But that night I got a glimpse across the veil to some demon's larder where a ghostly child was being prepared as a burnt offering to a dark god, like a deli ham waiting to be purchased for a frightful feast. And all these years later, I still can't shake the feeling I had that night when I saw that horrible sight. Nor can I help asking that one haunting question: why was I chosen to see it? Okay, I told y'all that was kind of creepy. I'm pretty sure that's fiction. I'm pretty sure that's a bit of fiction, but it's a weird horror story is what it is. And I hope you guys enjoyed it, got a little creepy feeling out of it, because you know what? I did. That's the creepiest story I've read in a long time. All the things that come into our imaginations are crazy, and the people that can convey those pretty good, that's a pretty good story. Okay, enough of this horror stuff. This email is from Bob. Here's what Bob writes. I'm 67 years old, and I've lived on Florida's East Coast all my life. Growing up here was a great treat for a boy back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We never got bored with the outdoors as our entertainment. My first experience was when I was 10 and a member of the Boy Scouts. We would have our scouting jamboree once a year, and all the scout troops from our district would come and camp. That year we traveled by church bus west into cattle country and down the riverbank for several miles, and we went way back into the woods. I was the bugler for the troop, meaning that I was up before dawn and I was the last one to go to bed. But one night after taps, I was with the scoutmaster sitting around his fire talking about the day's events when we heard a loud noise. It was like something smacking the side of a tree. Well, he stood up and peered into the night, seemingly very concerned. When I asked what he thought the loud noise was, he looked over at me and probably considered how young and impressionable I was. So not wishing to frighten me, he downplayed it and he told me that it was probably a bird. I was young, but I wasn't that impressionable. Birds don't fly at night or make loud noises like that, I said. The scoutmaster frowned at me and suggested it was time to crawl inside our tents and get some sleep. Around 3 o'clock that morning, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the quiet of the camp. There was a flurry of activity as people and scoutmasters ran past my tent. One of the young scouts was screaming and crying about an old, ugly man leaning over him during the night. He was so freaked out that they let him stay in another tent with one of the scoutmasters. I don't think anyone in the camp got any rest that night. And by daybreak, I was still wide awake. The leaders of our group kind of covered up the incident, and I never forgot it or the look on that kid's face. It actually scared the crap out of me. And as far as I knew, there was no one in camp who fit the description of an ugly old man. I wondered what that poor kid saw, and the noises I heard that night before bed were somehow connected. I bet my scoutmaster thought so. Well, years went by and I grew up camping and hunting and fishing in the backwoods of Florida. I belonged to a dog hunt club for a while, and we would track deer on foot, following beagles, following the scent. I would see human-looking footprints once in a while, and I would ask the other guys in the club who the hell would be out there walking barefoot. They always gave me the same stock answer: them Okeechobee boys. I asked why so many of them wore size 16 shoes. We had a deer lease, and I always got there a day before the rest of the club to set up camp. Well, it's nice and quiet, usually. But that night, something was throwing pine cones at my camper and grunting. I kept a .357 Blackhawk on the counter near my bed, so I figured that whatever was out there, as long as it stayed out there, we would all be good. It got me to thinking about that kid from my Boy Scout days, and I wondered how that night played out in his mind over the years. Many other tales, but this is getting too long and dinner is ready. I gotta go eat. I heard that, man. You can't turn down that supper even if you're writing a story. You gotta get up and go eat. But that was a great story. I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Let's see, the writer of this story, all I have is his email address, and I don't have a name, but that doesn't matter because this is really good. It's a Bigfoot story. I live in Maine. I'm a 42-plus year registered master Maine guide whose license includes mountaineering, open ocean, and blue water canoeing and kayaking. In addition, I'm a wilderness emergency medical instructor. I've shared my expertise with many people from Maine to Antarctica, and I include this information only to validate that I'm very comfortable in the outdoors. I've never had a reason to be afraid, a bit concerned at times, but never afraid. My story takes place in Maine, along where two rivers meet and merge with the Umbagog Lake on the western border of Maine and New Hampshire. The area is known as the Umbagog Wildlife Sanctuary. My ancestors migrated to the region in 1742 from Ireland. Back in the 1930s, a woman named Louise Rich wrote a book about growing up in the area called We Took to the Woods. There are a few roads, mostly rough logging trails, and canoeing is the best way to see all the wonders of this beautiful and pristine area. Umbagog is teeming with wildlife: bears, moose, bald eagles, and common loons around here. I've even seen mountain lions. And at night I have heard many strange sounds around camp, but most of those are identifiable. It may come as a surprise to many listeners of your podcast, but I have never carried a gun in my career as a guide, even though I grew up in the gun culture where I was taught the skills by my father and uncles. But I choose not to carry. The way I see it is I work with nature. I've learned to pay attention, and I know my wild neighbors, and yes, I have been 10 feet from black bears. I even stood my ground while a 1,000-pound, 24-point bull moose in rut stood his ground at 25 feet of distance. I don't advise this for your listeners. They will kill you twice, and you have to stay still. It is said that a bull moose is the most dangerous animal in the forest. One rolled a Volkswagen Bug over 14 times with 6 teenagers trapped inside. My story goes back to 1991. My girlfriend and I were canoe camping along the Magalloway River. Guys, on these pronunciations, I've just quit caring if I get them right, because I know 500 people are going to correct me in the comment section, but I'm pretty sure that means that word is Magalloway. We made camp and cooked a great meal and settled in for a nice day. We were waiting for the evening before we paddled onto the outlet of the Umbagog Lake for some stargazing. There would be a full moon that night. There is no light pollution there. The water is calm, and if we sat still, we could see the heavens above and below reflected on the lake. It was as if we were floating in the sky in our tiny watercraft. I call that awesomeness. We continued paddling as the moon rose over the horizon, lighting the shoreline as it climbed into the starry sky, and we paddled close to the shore to see if any ducks were nesting. Wood ducks love this area as there are many nesting boxes placed for them by the wildlife management. As we neared the shoreline, we were startled when we suddenly were showered by a barrage of rocks and sand. and my girlfriend thought she saw a shadowy figure on the shore. She started freaking out, and I spun my canoe around to get a better look at what was throwing rocks at us. I saw what I thought was a bear, but then it stood up. And I've seen bears stand on their hind legs as they sniff out an area, but this bear, when it stepped toward the forest edge and did not drop down on all fours, both of us heard a deep guttural growl. My girlfriend was going into hysterics, demanding that we leave now. I pulled on my paddle, propelling the canoe away from the shore, and as soon as we were in motion, everything went quiet. We paddled back to camp and left that night, and as we drove, my girlfriend seemed to be cursed with a case of fear-induced insanity. I called her crazy, which didn't help matters, and she told me that I was the crazy one for not carrying a gun, and things between us got so heated that we broke up that night. I took her home and went back to my place, and after a bad night's sleep, I decided that I needed answers. I had just lost my girlfriend, and I had to know what we experienced. So I drove back to the Umbagog where our campsite was still reserved for one more day. And I paddled back to where our encounter took place, and I anchored just off the bank. As evening came and darkness fell, I sat waiting for whatever we saw to come back. And at some point, I began to hear a buzzing, a metallic sound above me. The air seemed electrified. I felt a migraine coming on, and I started to go into what felt like some sort of a seizure. And when I came out of it, I didn't remember much afterward. The sun was lighting up the eastern skies. I pulled on my paddle and headed back to camp. My mind was preoccupied with strange images of things that I did not understand. And after an hour or so, I saw my campsite come into view. And there were people milling around, and I thought how rude they were messing with my stuff. A Maine game warden pulled the bow of my canoe onto the shore as he asked me for my name. I still didn't grasp this situation. His fellow officers swarmed around me with communication devices, and when I asked what the fuss was all about, it was revealed that the officers were in search and rescue and that they had been looking for me for the past 2 days. I have no recollection of those supposed lost days, and when the warden took my statement, I couldn't tell if he believed me or not. I'm not sure I believe what happened. Since then, I have only fleeting memory flashes of strange images and sounds. I still don't carry a weapon. It would not have changed a thing. All right, I told you that was a good one. Didn't I tell you? All 4 stories in this whole podcast were great, but that last one, that just blows my mind. It just leaves so many questions. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and I appreciate you listening this far, and I hope you'll join me on the next one. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thanks.